Hey, it's Nathaniel Stinnett with the Environmental Voter Project, and I'm really excited for another mini briefing today. So today we are going to be discussing Nebraska. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our work at the Environmental Voter Project, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on identifying people who care deeply about climate and the environment who don't vote and then mobilizing them to become better voters. In the fall of 2024, we are targeting 4.8 million of these low propensity climate voters across 19 different states. But today, we're talking about Nebraska. So let's go ahead and get started. If you're not familiar with these mini briefings, they are short 10 to 12-minute briefings, just giving you a quick dump of data on a particular topic. So this is what we're seeing in Nebraska right now. First off, at the Environmental Voter Project, we've identified 44,046 of these low propensity climate voters. So these are people who are already registered to vote. They're already registered to vote. They're highly likely to list climate or the environment as their number one priority over all other issues. Yet, we think they're unlikely to show up this fall without being mobilized to do so. And why do we think that? Because when we look at their public voting histories, they did not vote in the 2020 presidential election or any election since then. If that's their voting history, we think they're unlikely to show up this fall without being really pushed to do so. All right, so what does a number like that mean in Nebraska? Well, even though Nebraska is a pretty red state, it was decided by 182,000 votes in 2020. And so having 44,000 deeply unlikely to vote climate voters is not a small or insignificant number. It's a really, really big pool of potential political power in Nebraska. We're also looking at some important elections this year in Nebraska. The presidential race is important in Nebraska because, as I'm sure many of you know, the second congressional district is a really, really tight, even district. And each congressional district in Nebraska carries its own separate electoral college vote. So the battle for that Nebraska 2 electoral college vote is fairly tight. Also, Nebraska 2nd congressional district is a tight congressional race. How about that? And then finally, there are 2 US Senate races in Nebraska this fall because there's a special election going on. But one of them seems to be very competitive between the independent candidate and the Republican candidate. There's not a Democrat running for that one US Senate race. We're going to get into the details on that race in a second. All right. Nebraska has a pretty big early voting window. Early in-person voting is available as early as October 7th, and then it goes right up until the day before Election Day. All right. What do these 44,000 unlikely to vote environmentalists look like in Nebraska? Well, that's what we've got down here in this data bar. First, direct your eyes to the very, very bottom row that says Reg voters. That's the demographic breakdown of all registered voters in Nebraska. So for instance, 9.8% of registered voters in Nebraska are between the ages of 18 to 24. Or if we go over to the racial demographic information, 89.2% of registered voters in Nebraska are white. Okay, this next row up, LPEVs, that stands for low propensity environmental voters. These are the people we're targeting at the Environmental Voter Project. These are the 44,046 climate first registered voters who are unlikely to show up unless we have a sophisticated campaign mobilizing them to do so. The first thing you'll notice is they're disproportionately young. Not surprising. But what's interesting is they're actually not as disproportionately young as we see in many of our other states. If you add this up here, what we've got 67, 68% of the low propensity environmental voters in Nebraska are under the age of 35. 68% ain't that big compared to what we see in many other states, where as many as 80 or 85% of the low propensity environmental voters are under age of 35. So actually, these low propensity climate voters in Nebraska are older than what we see in many other states. Second thing I'll point out, there's a slight gender gap, but there's really there's a lot of missing data when it comes to the age of voters in Nebraska. So you can see there's a big percentage of unknown age for these voters, but women are slightly more represented among low propensity environmental voters than men are. Finally, look at the racial breakdown. Although Nebraska is a very, very, very white electorate, so 89% of registered voters are white in Nebraska, these low propensity environmental voters are much less white. They're disproportionately made up of people of color. So they're 15 percentage points less white. And a lot of what's going on there is that Black voters are 3 times more prevalent among these low propensity environmental voters than they are in the overall electorate in Nebraska. AAPI voters are almost 3 times as prevalent. Native American voters are almost 5 times more prevalent among these low propensity environmental voters. So again, this is not terribly different from what we see in many other states, but it is a little bit more dramatic. Usually Black voters aren't 3 times as prevalent, and Native Americans aren't 5 times as prevalent in our target audience. Part of that has to do with how small the numbers are, because again, this is a very, very white state. But the people we're mobilizing at EVP in Nebraska are much less white than the overall electorate. Okay, let's look at what's going on politically. As I mentioned, the Nebraska 2nd District carries its own electoral college vote. That has been a very, very close, tight race in the past few presidential elections. Now, you might remember, we had a round of redistricting since the most recent presidential election. So the boundaries of Nebraska 2 are slightly different from what we've seen before. But look, if you look at all of the polling, and this is aggregated by 538.com, you'll see that Harris seems to be fairly, I don't want to say comfortably, I would say consistently ahead in the polling and beyond the margin of error in that one electoral district. Similarly, the congressional race, so this is the Vargas-Bacon race, so Don Bacon is the Republican incumbent there. The challenger, Vargas, who also ran against Don Bacon 2 years ago in the midterms, is not doing as well as Harris is against Trump in the second, but is slightly ahead. But again, almost all of those numbers are within the margin of error. So let's not view this as Vargas being comfortably ahead. It's a very, very tight race there for the congressional district. In that 2nd Nebraska district, the Environmental Voter Project has identified 18,259 of these targets, these registered climate first, yet unlikely to vote voters. And as you can see, they are overwhelmingly concentrated in or right next to Omaha. All right. I want to talk about this Deb Fischer U.S. Senate race, where the independent candidate Osborne started getting people's attention a few months ago. The Democrats decided not to run a candidate, and Osborne had been polling well for a few months now, but it was all internal campaign bowls or affiliated super PACs, and I think a lot of people were waiting for some independent polls to come out. Well, the independent polls that have come out, there have been few of them, far too few than I think many of us would like, still show Osborne either a little bit ahead or a little bit behind Deb Fischer. So you'll see, according to 538.com, as of October 3rd, Deb Fischer is only ahead by 2.6 percentage points in the average of polls. I am not going to assert right here that this race is as close as this data makes it look. We just don't know. There is so little independent public polling on this race that it's very hard to know whether we're getting enough good data. Moreover, oh my gosh, look how low those overall numbers are. We have a whole bunch of undecided voters. And what is almost definitely going on here is that Nebraskans like the idea of voting for an independent, but know very little about the actual independent candidate. And obviously, you know, the number of undecideds dwindles down to close to zero on election day. So I expect there to be a lot of movement in this race because there are so many undecideds, but this is certainly something that, whereas a month or 2 months ago, people were saying, oh, yeah, maybe we should pay attention to that. Well, now I think people should really pay attention to it. This US Senate race in Nebraska is going to have a lot of movement over the last 30 or so days before the election. All right. If you would like to get involved in our work at the Environmental Voter Project, we are going to be mobilizing these 44,000 low propensity climate voters in Nebraska all the way until Election Day. We're doing aggressive direct mail and digital ads, but they are expensive. And so we would love your support in making a donation to support this voter turnout work. There will be a link in the notes, or you can go to environmentalvoter.org and donate there. You can also go to our website and sign up to phone bank voters in Nebraska. We've got a bunch of Nebraska phone banks coming up. Although we are not door-to-door canvassing in Nebraska, if you happen to live close to or are willing to travel to Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Tucson, or Austin, we are door-to-door canvassing in all 4 of those cities. And the final thing that you can do to support our work is subscribe to this YouTube channel so that you can get a notification whenever we do quick mini briefings like this. Finally, I will just say, we all know how important the 2024 elections are. We're so grateful that you are part of our community at the Environmental Voter Project as a donor or as a volunteer or even just as a follower. Thank you for being part of our work, and I hope to see you on a phone bank or to see your donation come through sometime soon. Thanks.